Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode for the War of the Rebellion podcast for Age Soul War. I'm your host, Niels Eichhorn. And today we are going to the great western desert state of Utah. And we're going to talk with two professors at Brigham Young University, Jay Buckley. Jay received his PhD from the University of Nebraska and has worked at Brigham Young since 2001. He is also the director of the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies and a very distinguished Western historian. Joining him and me is Jeffery Nokes. He is an associate dean at Brigham Young and also a professor of history. He is with Brigham Young since 2006 and received his PhD from the University of Utah. What are we talking about? We are talking about their new book, Great Plains Forts, published by Bison Press in December 2003. 2023, not 2003. That would have been a long time ago. So thank you so much, both of you, for joining me today. And let's just get into it here. Tell us the origin story. How did you two agree to write a book about Western forts?
Well, I had done my PhD work at the University of Nebraska and at the Center for Great Plains Studies, and they have an agreement with the University of Nebraska Press through Bison Books to do a series on the Great Plains. So I was approached by the director of that series to see if I would be interested in writing a volume for them. And so we bounced around some ideas on possible topics and agreed that it would be interesting to write about the Great Plains forts. Then I had a few other book projects come before, and I needed to get back on this project. So I invited my good friend and colleague, Jeff Nokes, to join me. He and I had done several other book projects together, and I really enjoyed those experiences. So I asked him if he wanted to collaborate on this project with me, and he said yes. So we co-authored this book, and I think it's a lot of fun. It covers a lot of topics from indigenous fortifications in 1100 AD all the way up to Air Force bases today. So it's kind of a sweeping, broad survey, but I think there's some interesting stories and details that the general public will enjoy.
So Jeff, I'm going to throw it over to you. Is there any kind of I had one time with guys who were like, we decided to write this book during a baseball game. Any kind of situation where you kind of go back and you're like, ooh, that was the moment where we two agreed over like something like a dinner or so to write this?
Y- Yeah, I don't remember, to tell you the truth, in any kind of moment, but I know Jay and I have worked together, as he said, on a few projects. And so when he approached me with this, so I should probably clarify, I'm in the history department, but my PhD is in teaching and learning with
Mhm.
a focus on history teaching.
Yes.
So I'm not a historian in the traditional sense of historian. And so uh, knowing that I could lean on him for his history background, but I'm a decent storyteller, and so and a decent writer, and so leaning on his strengths and me doing what I could to help him, uh, it turned out to be a fun project to work on together.
As a follow-up, how did it work? Like, this is I usually kind of hitting myself here a little bit. I usually did not do an interview like edited collection or two author books because in the past when I did written interviews, it was very difficult to get two people. They had to coordinate their answers, but here it's a great opportunity. How did you manage that? Like reading your book, I could not detect like there was one chapter that definitely was written by a different person, that it was one voice throughout. How did you manage to get that done so well?
Well, when we started, the first process was deciding what the chapters were going to be
Mhm,
dealing with. And Jay, again, with his background, he had some good ideas, and I made a few suggestions, and we worked out a table of contents.
mhm,
And then we split that table of contents just about 50-50, him taking the areas where he had some great expertise, and he would do the first draft of those chapters.
mhm,
And then in the other chapters where I felt like I might be able to, brush up on some of my history and look at some primary sources and things, I took on those chapters. And so we wrote drafts of the chapters independently I mean, our offices are just down the hall from each other. And so there'd be those kinds of collaborations where
mhm,
I'd get stumped on a question or he wondered something. And so there's a little bit of collaboration during the writing process, but typically we'd pretty much write independently the chapters to start, and then we would share and go through and, like you said, try to create that common voice. So he's more academic in his writing than I am. He
mhm,
he is a really a talented historian, and the press didn't want footnotes. They wanted something that was a little more accessible to the
mhm.
general public. And so I would tone him down sometimes and say, Jay, you sound a little academic here. He's just too smart. And then every once in a while, he'd tell me, "You got to beef this up a little bit," and we'd revise. And anyway, that was my take on how we put it together. Jay, I don't know if you have things to add.
And then at the end, I kind of went through the whole manuscript and worked on some transitions and
Mhm.
added a few segments to augment chapters that were a little shorter than they were and things like that. And so we did work hard to have a unified voice. And Jeff's such a gifted storyteller that I could provide him some research materials and he could create a narrative out
Yeah.
of it. And so that was pretty cool. So it was a wonderful collaboration.
Yeah, there were I kind of thinking back, there were some nice stories in there of kind of like the what was it? I think the was it the fourth chap? Yeah, the fourth chapter where you talk about that lady that travels to different outposts with her husband. That was sort of
Yeah,
very
Susan
engagingly
McGoffin.
done. Yeah.
Jeff tells that story well. Do you want to just give a little narrative of Susan Shelby McGoffin?
Yes. So Susan was a young woman when she married an older man. He was how much older than her? 20?
Twice as old.
Yeah.
Oh
She
my
was just a
gosh.
teenager. And
Mm,
he had made his fortune on the Santa Fe Trail. And so not long after they got married, he outfitted a caravan and they were ready to go. And she traveled with them. And she kept this absolutely delightful journal of the trail.
nice.
I mean, it is just a joy to read every page of that. She was a teenager
Mhm.
and she was romantic as could be. She called herself the wandering princess of the prairie, and there were servants that were accompanying her, and it's just really fun to read her journal. Somewhere along the trail, she had some trouble with the carriage, and she was ejected from the carriage and fell, and she was expecting a baby at that time. And after that incident, she started to worry about the baby. And it wasn't long after that time, they got to Bent's Fort. And while she was at Bent's Fort, she gave birth to a stillborn baby that just was absolutely traumatic for her.
Mhm.
And that same day that she gave birth, an indigenous woman came to the fort and gave birth also to a healthy baby, which just added to her distress. But it really is a great story to tell about the nature of the forts, because you have people coming, indigenous people and travelers passing through that were all pretty much welcome to this fort and knew it was a resource that could help them with repairing their wagons or carriages or giving birth to a baby, whatever, the needs were at the time. But Susan, if your viewers have a chance, want to read something that's just really special, her journal, if you did some Googling, you could find what do you
It's
remember?
listed in our bibliography.
Yeah.
We tried to include as many primary sources as we could from a whole variety of perspectives. So we have indigenous voices, African American voices, women voices, immigrant voices, military voices, and hopefully it kind of presents a fuller, richer account than just, what was happening at some military fort on the plains or something like that.
Right. No, certainly. And I think that's I'm trying to think back when I saw your book and asked the press to send me a copy. I guess at the moment I sort of was expecting like maybe the fur trade, but then mostly the military. And you really surprised me with the first chapter, because that I had not expected. I had not like hadn't studied much about. So tell us a little bit about Native Americans and actually having fortified villages.
Sure. Well, that's one of the things we tried to do is have some surprises in each of the chapters so that the readers who even thought they might know about a topic would find something new. I was really interested to think about the way indigenous people used fortifications in their villages and on war raids and in defense. Because like you, we were often raised thinking of Hollywood and the movies that we see and, John Wayne films and John Ford directed things. And most of them are in kind of the Civil War, Indian Wars era, and they're mostly military forts. And so our minds automatically are drawn to that as like the first thing we think about with forts. But we often don't think about how forts preceded any newcomers coming to the American continent. Indigenous people have been constructing fortifications as long as they've lived here. And so one of the things that I had to do as a historian was to use archaeology and other kinds of sources that I don't typically use in my writing to try to draw out what life was like in 1000 AD or 1500 AD pre-contact. And so one of the things that emerged, however, was as indigenous people began moving out onto the Great Plains, they first started on the fringes because those were the most livable areas, places that had water, trees, other kinds of resources. And before the acquisition of the horse, it was very difficult to live out on the plains and in a permanent type of way. And so what happened was these earth lodge villages and other kinds of structures were created up and down the river systems of the eastern part of the Great Plains. And indigenous people began fortifying those villages in the 13 and 1400s because of increased indigenous pressures and raids from other indigenous parties. And so groups like the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara peoples were creating fortified villages in the Dakotas and other locales, as well as tribes in the South, the Caddoan-speaking peoples in Texas and Oklahoma and other places. And so it was kind of interesting for me to not only combine those archaeological records, but use oral histories from native sources and European accounts of when they visited those villages, and they would describe how many homes were there and how large the palisades were and how deep the ditches were and about the gates and all of that different kind of thing. And we don't often think of fortified villages on the plains as being a place where you'd live, but you can understand if there were threats, you would want to protect yourself. And so then we had to find out, what are they protecting themselves from? And so some of these sites have huge massacres of, 400 or 500 people, men, women, and children, that were killed and ritualistically mutilated and buried in mass graves, as early as like 1400 AD. And so this is, hundreds of years before any kind of contact with Europeans or other newcomers. And so it just adds richness to the story of an indigenous point of view. And it continues up through the 19th and 20th centuries as well. So when Blackfeet raiding parties would go to steal horses, for instance, they would construct certain kinds of defensive lodges that were quick to put up, but a form of refuge in case people they stole their horses from weren't happy that they had. So it was kind of fun to just look at all of the different kinds of things, both temporary and permanent kinds of fortifications of earth, stone, wood, other kinds of materials. And so that was a really fun chapter to write.
Now, I'm gonna, because just as you were talking, came to me sort of as a thought, like, what were your boundaries? How did you define your boundaries for the Great Plains? Because that's the frame of it. Like, I'm like,
yeah.
Like
one of the blessings I had was, as a graduate student at the University of Nebraska, I was a research assistant at the Center for Great Plains Studies.
And
as a result, the cartographers and geographers had already delineated what their points of view of what the Great Plains was, due to vegetation, rainfall, flora and fauna, other kinds of metrics. And so that's how the three Canadian prairies of Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and help me out with the other one, Jeff. Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. Those prairie provinces were part of the Great Plains geography, just by virtue of the kinds of landscape. And then the Plains states, one of the features primarily is the great grasslands. And so that has a particular type of geology and geography, and only certain kinds of animals and plants and peoples, they have to adapt to that environment because it's so different. So that's how we identified it, is by using the Center for Great Plains Studies delineation. I think Clark Archer and David J. Weber were the two geographers and cartographers that worked on that.
And there were still a few kind of fuzzy areas, because you have a fort that's built in the foothills of the Rockies. Is that technically maybe not on the Great Plains, but still influential on the Great Plains? So we would be sometimes lenient in those gray areas.
So you can roughly think it's bounded by the Rockies on the western side, and the Mississippi drainage on the eastern side. That's approximately what we're talking about.
Right. No, I'm kind of like I lived in southeastern New Mexico, and I was in the Llanos Estacados, so I was like, that's sort of the plains in a different form than what you would have in North Dakota, but it's
very dry plains.
Yeah, no kidding. It was dry, that's for sure. They don't get as much nice tumbleweed up there, so that's we got.
Well, fortunately, with Jeff's writing style, our book's not dry at all. It's it's just pretty
There we
interesting.
go. Well, I guess I could ask, like, are you gonna do like the Forts of the Southwest or the Mountain West next?
We'll have to see what his time will allow for future collaborations, but it's not out of the question.
Oh, good, good. You kind of already answered some of the other thoughts that I had with regard to kind of the villages, but I guess when we really think about it, then many of us have read like Lewis and Clark's diary, so it would be like, of course, we should have seen this one with the Native American fortresses, or as a student, I had to read Jedediah Smith's or a book on Jedediah Smith, since we don't really have his diaries. He never left us
Yeah,
one, but that Arikara battle that he is engaged in, which also is fortified. So it's
I'm writing an article about that right now.
well, interesting.
Yeah.
Uh,
It's so interesting you say that though, because the fortifications pop up in places and photographs and paintings and accounts that I had read before. But now, when I was looking for the fortifications, I could actually see the palisades around the village that
right.
George Catlin painted. Whereas before, I wasn't really interested or looking for the fortification.
Right. I was just going to ask, isn't this somewhat like it was always there? It was staring us in the face and we just never picked up on it?
Definitely.
Yeah. It's, yeah, sometimes those weird situations. But since we are on Lewis and Clark and Jedediah Smith, this kind of is the second stage then of fortifications in the plains. And let me phrase the question this way, like how like Native American fortifications, early explorers, fur traders, like trade posts along the like routes into the west, what changes? What is the same? How do I like we all have pictures from Hollywood in our mind. Like how what does it really look like?
I would say these early fortifications by explorers like Lewis and Clark and Zebulon Pike, or fur traders and trappers that were constructing posts along the Missouri or its tributaries, um, were probably smaller than we kind of
Okay.
think about in terms of the military establishment and the bigger buildings. Um, some of them could become quite grand, like Fort Union or Fort Laramie or Bent's Fort.
Mhm.
Um, but for the most part, the ones that weren't the main feature pieces like those were smaller entities. Um, they could be constructed out of sod or wooden
Hmm.
palisades or other kinds of things. And sometimes they would last for a decade or two, and other times only a short while. And so they had to first find out where the best locations would be to construct them, and then also which indigenous people's homelands were those located in. So
Um,
if you're going to trade with the Crows, it would be a good idea, as Jim Beckworth thought, to ask them, where do you want this post to be?
right.
And they would actually tell him, we'd rather have it up on this river than down on that one because it's easier to get to, or
Mm.
not as close to our enemies, or whatever. And so that was really interesting too, to find out how indigenous people played such a key role in this fur trade era in locating the forts, helping protect them, etc. Most of those fur trade posts, there weren't a lot of native attacks on them, because they were providing benefit from
Hmm.
both the indigenous point of view, but also advancing the fur traders' economics as well. So, um, I don't know. Do you want to add anything, Jeff?
Yeah, the one group that usually wasn't happy with the forts being built were the enemies of the nation where the fort was established. And so
Right.
if they had to have defenses, it was defenses for those potential raids that might come from outsiders that would travel a distance to the fort. So there's a mistake in thinking indigenous people and lumping them all together and thinking, these indigenous nations are nations. They're separate and independent and rivals. And you saw those rivalries play out as these forts were being built. No nation wanted a fort to be established in its enemy's boundaries and territory because it meant they were going to gain access to guns, ammunition, and other trade goods that would give them an advantage against them.
So sort of diplomacy playing out in some form here is that it's like, I want what you have and I will prevent what you have from actually materializing.
And not only do you have the rivalries between the indigenous nations, but by the 1830s, you have competition between fur companies.
Right.
And so they're building rival posts right next to each other sometimes. And we can see this in our modern day cities where bookstores or grocery chains or other kinds of things will kind of see who can outcompete in a neighborhood. And so that's kind of what was going on there too.
Yeah, it sort of like reminds me of Hobbs where I lived. It was like, here's Home Depot, 5-minute walk, not even drive, 5-minute walk away, like a minute drive. There's Lowe's, like they're like right next to each other. Like, wow. Like,
yeah,
exactly. Like you want, this is the perfect spot for it, and you're gonna go for it. And I guess in entailing what you're saying is that were these more for like show when it comes to defense, or like I can't really, like, I don't know how many people we're talking about when we talk about like a fur trade outpost. Is it like 10 guys, 20 guys, 30 guys? Like, do they even have a chance to defend that larger palisade wall against a committed attack? Like,
that's a good point, because often these are more of warehouses and storage facilities because the trappers and traders would be going off to get involved in certain kinds of activities, right? So unless it's to defend against grizzly bears or blackfeet or something like that, there's not like a military unit that's stationed at the fort to protect it. It's just the people that are there. So you've got a chief trader or bourgeois, who's kind of the one who's responsible. He would accept the items in trade for the furs and hides that he exchanged them for. And then it could be a place of refuge if there was danger, where the trappers or traders could come back, and then together they could help fortify that position. And so, yeah, you're right that that's why these smaller establishments were, built in that way so that they could just be a safe place to store materials.
Okay.
And Jay can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I think probably the strongest defense for some of the forts were the local indigenous people who would a lot of times build their encampments around the fort so they could be close, and they served as somewhat of a defense as far as the numbers went, probably more so than Americans were.
Right. No, that makes total sense. Now I'm going to throw you guys a curveball question, because you already said that these forts don't last long, and just like it's wooden material, it's like it rots away. I mean, it totally makes sense. Like if you don't maintain it, it goes away. But where in the West would we, like, if somebody today wanted to be like, I want to see what like a fur trade outpost looked like, where would I go? Is there a place where I could still see like something reminiscent of that?
There are. Many of those have been reconstructed.
Okay.
So they're not like they were in 1825, but we wouldn't expect them to be 2 centuries later. And so you can go to, Fort Bridger, Fort Laramie, Bent's Fort, Fort Union, Fort Garry, Lower Fort Garry. Some of these have been maintained and have become national historic sites or state parks or private entities. And so there's some upkeep and visitation that continues there. And so all of those places are wonderful to visit. Bent's Fort's really fun to go to because it's built in a different fashion than the others. It's mostly adobe in the Southwest down in Colorado. Whereas when you go to Fort Laramie, it's more of the military complex where they have the stables for the horses and the commissaries and all the buildings for the hospital and the everything. And then Fort Union, the classic one in Montana and North Dakota, they're on the border. That was kind of the center of the fur trade from the 1830s to the 1860s. And so it's kind of been kept in that historic era. It didn't change over time, like say Fort Laramie. And so those are, you can see a whole variety of different things, but you're right that there aren't very many that would remain. And those that did were usually at key geographic, strategic locations, or had additional purposes later, like they served the Overland Trail, or they're located on a key river or road or railroad or something like that. So that ensured that some lasted and some didn't.
The key to lasting was repurposing as the times changed. So during the fur trade era, the forts that were great as part of the fur trade, when that era was winding down, those that became emporiums for pioneer travel across the plains, they stayed, and the others faded away into the prairie. And then after the pioneer era, those that were able to become military establishments and had an important location. But repurposing was really the key to the forts continuing to exist. In our at the end of the book, there's a guide that goes through by each Canadian province and then each state, the forts that are there. And in that guide, it talks about which ones are still, you can still go and there's something there. Some of them, there's just a historical marker, but some of them have been reconstructed. And some of them we don't know. I mean, we just don't know where they were exactly because the prairies reclaimed them so well.
Yeah,
we also didn't list a lot of the indigenous ones just out of respect for the people who remain. And we don't want trespassers or vandals to interfere in any fashion with that. So unless they were already known sites, we didn't include those locations.
Oh, that's very, very nice. And considering Western tourism, definitely a good decision because, people like to go off-roading a lot in the West. No. So yeah, I want to go back to like your appendix there was also forts later a little bit. And I will also say that for a few moments that you threw me off because because I have a very different Fort Union in mind when you say Fort Union. I have the one in New Mexico in my mind, which is vastly different, of course.
We wrote about both of them.
You did. Yes, you did. And well, I suppose that is a good lead over to that other Fort Union because it is located on the Santa Fe Trail. And with that comes a new opportunity now, right? That like we're not quite, I don't want to quite yet go to the military age when the US military enters, but when these forts move away from being emporiums for the fur traders, but become spaces where people can stop and rest along the way. So how does that change in any shape or form the character of these forts that you now have every few weeks for a few months, tons of people coming through, going to Oregon, California, So Mormons going to Utah and stuff.
Oh, yeah, it definitely changed the nature of the forts. At certain times of the year, depending on where they were on the trail,
Mm-hmm.
those that were further to the east, they'd get hit early in the spring with just crowds of people, depending on the era, what era of the pioneer travel we're talking about.
Right.
But yeah, they would just be there would be an overflow of traffic at certain times of the year. And then they'd be pretty quiet after that
Mm.
rush of traffic would pass through. But those pioneer journals give us a pretty good feel for kind of the chaos a little bit
Mm-hmm.
at some of these forts. In fact, one of the journals, the pioneers wrote about how the soldiers that were stationed at the fort were trying to buy goods from them
Mm.
from the pioneers traveling through because there were shortages of whiskey and other things at the fort
Oh.
in these rush times. But yeah, it
Oh.
definitely changed. And again, Jay can probably add more about that.
Well, I mean that
Yeah,
like I'm just going
Jeff
to do a
brings up
follow up on that. How do you like you're supposed to supply people, but you need to get supplies too, right? So you have to rely on wagons delivering supplies to you that then people traveling by wagon continue taking with them.
And the government was very supportive of pioneer travel. And so in some
Yeah.
cases, the forts were required to sell the goods at basically at cost or with very little profit when they were being
Oh,
managed
wow.
and run by government organizations. But
Oh my
Yeah,
gosh.
when you think about somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000 immigrants
Yeah.
are traveling across the Great Plains to Utah, Oregon, California, New Mexico, um, there there's going to be a lot of need
Wow.
at each of those locations. And so one of the things that some of the entrepreneurs figured out pretty quickly is they would make more money supplying the fortifications than they would being the owners of the fort. One of the people who did this was Robert Campbell. He had learned during the fur trade that even though he built several forts, he'd made a lot more money when he was supplying the rendezvous uh,
Yeah.
people that were traveling to the summer fair. And so he became one of the principal suppliers out of St. Louis for places like Fort Laramie and some of the other forts on the Missouri. And so they would have to try to get as many supplies out there for the spring rush
Yeah.
before the onslaught of the migrants who would leave um, from the eastern part of the plains in
Mhm.
April or May to start their 2 to 3 to 4 month journey across the plains. And so
Wow.
um, you're right that that was a logistics that they had to figure out. And one of the reasons that why after 1869, with the coming of the railroads, there wasn't quite as much need for these fortifications in some locations, just because the railroad or steam travel or other kinds of transportation could supply that want.
Yeah, that's a great lead over too, because now, so by the 1850s, 60s, we're seeing the railroad construction moving westward, where like we're still seeing a massive flow of people to California, Oregon, Utah, Colorado with the gold rush in 1860. So there's still like tons of people traveling through the plains. But now you also have some military entering the picture, and like in the case of Fort Laramie, they're taking over Fort Laramie. So do some of those proprietors, businessmen stay at these forts and just kind of, well, there's the military next door, but I'm still going to do what I have done for the last 10 years? Or are they kind of rethinking their role in the new environment?
You want to take this one, Jeff?
well, I was waiting for you, but yeah, I I think Fort Laramie is probably a good example of that transition. And Jay, you know a lot more about Fort Laramie than I do, so maybe you could use that as an example to talk about that.
Okay. Yeah. So when the Army they get involved in the overland trail travel, And there are congressional acts that get the U.S. military involved in protecting the immigrant trains and also Indians from depredation from migrants. And so that's used as the justification for either commandeering, renting, or buying these posts and taking them over. For example, in the case of Fort Laramie, they buy the fur trade post and then it triples in size as more men and personnel and other things come out there. The same is true at Fort Leavenworth, which is one in Kansas that is now one of the largest forts in the United States. And it's been around since 1827. And so these posts, like Jeff mentioned, that could be repurposed for other needs were really important. And one other item that you might find interesting for your Civil War listeners is that during and following the Civil War, there was a lot more expansive mindset of using the military for conquest of indigenous nations. And so some of the stories we tell are forts that were built during the Civil War era out on the plains for like the Bozeman Trail Wars, for instance. And so those have such an interesting history about how they're trying to protect the trails, but they were totally unable to do so because the Lakotas were just in control for that whole war, basically, until new armaments came out in 1867. But some Civil War aficionados may not know that Sherman and Sheridan and Custer had all cut their teeth during the Civil War, and then they're transferred out onto the Great Plains after the Civil War to be involved in these military campaigns on the northern, central, and southern plains. And so we try to provide some context for that. And also, the last Confederate general to surrender was an indigenous man named Stanwati, a member of the Cherokee Nation, who had ran a unit of the Cherokee Braves that had fought on behalf of the Confederacy. And he doesn't surrender until several months after Appomattox. And so it's kind of an interesting side note.
No, totally, right. And it's when you the reality, like you're saying, right? There's a lot of Civil War historians who are like, Virginia and everything beyond Virginia doesn't matter. But I always told my students in my classes that I was like, it's not like we like old video recording systems, right? We put the stop button on and everything stops in the West. It continues. It's still ongoing. It's different players, different interactions, maybe. It's not the US military, it's maybe state militia units, but they're all still fighting. There's people still moving west. It's not like this, there's an end to it. Or nothing happens.
Right.
You're muted, Jeff.
Part of the aftermath of this conquest was the removal of many indigenous nations to reservations. And the military and the U.S. government constructed fortifications adjacent to each of those indigenous reservations. Some reason was for helping supply the agencies and the reservations, but part of it too was for patrolling and to make sure that people weren't leaving that shouldn't and stuff like that. So there's a lot of interaction that continues into the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. And so we've tried to include some examples of that as well.
Sorry, Jeff, you were...
You know what? That's just almost exactly what I was about to say. So great mind alike.
Yes, like we said before we started. But I kind of liked your point, and I kind of want to throw this out to you and see what your thoughts are. That a video I showed my students to kind of give them a very brief kind of statement of like what to imagine a Western fort looked like. And the authors of this were like, when it came down to Western Plains forts in the kind of third quarter, let's say, of the 19th century, they weren't the forts of like European armies fighting each other, like fortifications. They were outposts for a constabulary force, a police force, and that the US military sort of was a police force that kept an eye on activities in the West and sometimes had to take a bigger role in regard to fighting. Would you agree with that as sort of a characterization?
I
Yeah.
would. I think a lot of the 19th century forts are actually modeled on the indigenous fortifications that the Mandan and Hidatsas and Arikras had already employed in their villages. The 18-foot logs that are buried 3 or 4 feet deep, leaving about a 15-foot palisade.
Mhm.
The walls of the homes inside, adjacent to the walls, about 5 feet down below the top of the wall, so that you could walk along the edge of the thing and find some protection
Mhm.
from an invading force. I see that same construction in many of the fur trade and military forts. Some additions that were included were bastions on each end,
Mhm.
kind of in a opposite end of the rectangle, so that you could find firing lines down all 4 walls of the fort. And that's why many of the forts were in some kind of a square or rectangular fashion. But
Mhm.
there are other forts that were circular or used other kinds of architectural designs as well. So I think just these aren't like forts that you would see in a castle in Europe or
Yeah.
Austria, um,
Yeah.
because there's not a lot of cannon fire that's going to be besieging the fort and things like that. And so it's just a different style of warfare, and there was no need to go to that great expense to build these
Mhm.
huge things if that wasn't the case.
I think the closest thing you see to European fortifications are the Spanish presidios that are built
Mhm.
in the 17th and 18th century before they really realized what the fighting was going to be like, in on the plains. And so, yeah, that's the closest thing. But a lot of these other, what we call forts, some of them had a wall that was completely missing, like they'd just be three-sided, open
Right.
towards the stream, so they weren't uh, what we call forts were really more what you'd think of as a trading post or just an
Mhm.
outpost in some cases.
Well, yeah, and some like I'm thinking of Fort Union and Fort Davis places that I have seen, they had no walls at all in those cases,
Yeah.
especially like the post-Civil War one. And let me again throw this out. Do you think that the US military kind of was like, well, why should we put palisades around it? An enemy would not be stupid enough to attack a fort with 400 soldiers inside of it. Is that sort of the thinking behind it, or is it that arrogance or realism that just no, they would not do this?
Well, I'm trying to think of some examples. I can't think of too many times when indigenous peoples attacked fortifications,
Right.
because they recognized that it was foolhardy and that they would be at a disadvantage.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the same is true for in 1823, this Arikara War that I'm writing about.
Mm-hmm.
Colonel Leavenworth is sent
Right.
upriver to go
Mm-hmm.
punish the Arikaras, and he fires on their village for 3 days. And after that time, he's like, we're not really making much headway, right? So the fortifications work for those kinds of things. And so I think by trial and error, both indigenous people and Americans both figured out the forts are mainly to provide housing and shelter and storage for goods, and then um, they're and some defense, but not necessarily its primary thing.
Yeah, Fort Kearny is another just great example of what
Mm.
pioneers would arrive at Fort Kearny and they would say, "What is this? This is not a fort." I mean, even then, it didn't look like what they expected a fort to be. There are a few sod huts but there's no palisade around it, and it was disappointing for a lot. In the journals, you can read about their disappointment when they got there.
I
And
bet
Nils, you have to also remember this is the Great Plains.
yeah,
There's not many trees.
I
So
know, right?
you know how many trees it takes to build a fort?
A
So
lot.
you have to either have a wooded river valley that has this resource, or you need to wait till the railroad where you can ship
Yeah,
some in. So
right. It makes
yeah,
no sense, right? Like, why would I build a massive fort with massive palisades when there's no trees that I can use?
yeah.
Um, no, I, but I think you're correct, right? Like, it's sort of this. People have sort of that image in their minds then and now of like what a fort military outpost looks like, and it's sort of like, oh, that's not what I expected to see. Like I think that you have that a lot even still today with tourists that they come to these forts and they're like, oh, no, I did not think that would be what I would see.
Yeah.
Most of the forts that have been reconstructed do have walls. I'm thinking
Hmm.
of Lower Fort Garry up in Manitoba, or Fort Fort Laramie had a wall at one time. Bent's Fort is
Hmm.
kind of an enclosed place. Fort Snelling, definitely fortified. So
Right.
you the ones that remain do look fortish, if you will. There's the elements of defensive fortifications of ditches or walls or
Right.
bastions or palisades or whatever.
And
Or Benton.
that might contribute to the kind of this wrong view of what the majority of the forts look like, because these exceptions are still, you can still visit, see.
Well, yeah, they're inviting, right? Like that's what I expect to see, so that's what I'm, oh, happy to see. It's
Mhm.
like self-fulfilling prophecy on some levels there. Um, but I do want to at the end talk a bit about Hollywood and the image of the fort. But let's turn briefly to Canada because I was you made a good case earlier on, like why Canada matters, and in the book you do too. But um, how did you feel writing about Canada? I think you're both more U.S. historians, so Canada was something a little bit less normal for you guys to kind of look at, right?
Oh, it that was one of my favorite chapters to write. I think
Okay.
because it was a little bit unfamiliar to me. So I took the first pop at it and Jake cleaned it up after. But I was really interested in um, just the role, just the connection between the United States and Canada during the
Mm-hmm.
time period. This is post the when the fur trade is starting to wind down a little bit, and the trade shifts to buffalo robes. Fort Benton, which was on the Missouri River in Montana,
Mm-hmm.
became they call it the world's most innermost inlandmost port. So boat travel could travel all the way up the Mississippi and then the Missouri all the way into Montana, and then goods could be shipped by wagons across the border into Canada. And by goods, uh, alcohol was one of the primary goods that was being shipped across. And there were a handful of American merchants, United States merchants, who just made a fortune shipping from Fort Benton across the border illegally into Canada the alcohol, and then they would load up the buffalo robes and bring them back, make a fortune
Mm-hmm.
on that trade. And so it didn't take long before a lot of Americans were engaged in this. And as this trade expanded, uh, after a while, there started to be some contention, some fighting, and the people that lived in this area of Canada, a lot of them had descended from French, a lot of them were
Mm-hmm.
indigenous, had indigenous roots. They were not huge fans of this the Canadian government, the new Canadian government. And
Yeah.
so Canada started to have some worries about what might happen out here with all these strong ties between the United States and Canada. And so they sent the Northwest Mounted Police out into the area to try to put an end to the illegal trade that was going on. And there were no trails across the plains of the prairies of Canada because
The Whoop Up Trail.
what's that?
The Whoop Up Trail.
Yeah, so the Whoop Up Trail and most of the trails were running north and south from the American side to the Canadian side. So there weren't any trails going east and west. The rivers were used primarily for transportation east and west. So when the Northwest Mounted Police headed out, they had a terrible time finding these forts, were at risk of perishing through a winter where they really didn't know where they were. Finally, once they got established, their goal was to end trade with the Americans, but they brought families and they brought settlers, and that actually expanded the trade. They just put an end to the illegal trade, and Fort Benton continued to be an important emporium for goods that were being shipped into the prairie regions of Canada. It's really an interesting story of and strong connections between the United States and Canada through that.
And I just got back from visiting some of those Canadian forts a few months ago. And, it's hard being in Utah or in Austria and thinking about a place that is as flat as Manitoba, but man,
that's easy.
you can see a long ways. And so, like he says, the river travel was preferred if possible. And then if not, Red River carts or some other mode of transportation could be used. But going overland was sure a lot more work and took a lot more time sometimes. And so one of the other things is that Canadians would, they had a little different fort building style. They would, instead of having the palisades go up and down, they would go horizontal. So they would put them on some kind of a base so that it wouldn't rot, and then build the walls up, whitewash them. Or they even had some kind of mortise and tenon connections where they could interlace the logs so they would be sturdier. So some interesting dynamics that were a little different from some of their American counterparts.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask about that because I was kind of curious if let me start by this. How, okay, I understand the US military in the West, right? Like we have our cavalry units, we have the always overlooked infantry units, say company here, companies there, like maybe 5 companies in a bigger fort, and we send like 700, 800, 1,000 men out to corner like Sitting Bull or go after the Nez Perce. What do I have to imagine numbers wise, equipment wise, with like the Northwest Mounted Police? Like, I kind of have that cheesy movie with that one guy going west out trying to deal with all these native problems in my mind right now.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that as far as the numbers that were stationed at the different outposts. Yeah, that's a good question. Do you have an idea about that, Jay? My sense is that they weren't stationed by large numbers of troops. That's my gut feeling, but I don't know that I've ever really researched the numbers exactly.
And before that time, most of the law and order was actually conducted by the Hudson's Bay Company. And so they had a series of laws and expectations that natives and newcomers would operate under. And so they would administer justice according to how those laws were being followed. So I don't think there was a huge military presence on the plains because, first of all, there weren't too many Canadians that were going there to live unless they were involved in trade. And so many of the traders either intermarried or became living like indigenous and Métis peoples were living.
Right.
And so I would say that it was more controlled by the company for a while, and then some mounted police later on in the
Mhm.
60s
Yeah.
and 70s.
Well, yeah, and when you, as you mentioned, the Métis, because Duncan Campbell and I have that in our new book, the Civil War in the Age of Nationalism. It's like it's guys from the East, militia units, troops from the East coming to, um, gosh, what would this be like Alberta and Saskatchewan for the Red River Rebellion to put that down. So it's not even local forces necessarily that would be engaged in this. So it's yeah, no, it's an interesting contrast, I guess, to kind of
Mm-hmm.
see these differences between how Canadians versus the United States do this Western Plains policing process. Now let's talk about we kind of like I tell my I usually talk about idioms when I teach English, and of course, why the elephant in the room is always the one that I like to bring up to kind of be like, what does this mean to my students? But for us, today's the elephant in the room is sort of Hollywood, that the image Hollywood has given us with regard to the Western fort. So, which let me start with worst. Which Hollywood movie does the worst when it comes to presenting a Western fort? Let's start with that one.
Hmm. Well, that I've just been thinking of some of the recent movies that have been made. Have you seen The Revenant?
I have.
That depicts a fort, um, but it also is a little bit different than the fort probably would have looked like. Do you know
Mm-hmm.
what I mean? And so
Right.
it conveys a certain idea. Oh goodness, what are some other ones, Jeff?
As far as a particular movie, I can't name a particular movie, but just that scene of all of the Indians attacking openly stone fort is just really, really wrong. I mean, it's as likely that there were indigenous people in the fort helping defend it if there was an
Right.
assault on the fort, and the forts definitely don't look like the ones that are are shown in most of these Hollywood films. And so I think, to me, that's the biggest misconception, is the idea that the indigenous people are all one unified force
Mm-hmm.
that is against those that are in the forts, when in actuality, just really uh, a different scenario than that, much more complicated, with allies and enemies in really complicated kinds of ways.
Yeah, there's a lot more peace and friendship and comity
Mm-hmm.
than we would commonly think of.
Well, that doesn't make for good movies, so. But I kind of adding to that when you say like the attack of natives onto a fort, I kind of showed, I think it was like Seventh Cavalry with Randall Scott, just the opening 2 minutes to my students, and I was like, look, this is how large the Seventh Cavalry is. Do you think that many men plus horses fit in that fort that Hollywood just gave us? And most of my students were like, yeah, you're right. They don't fit. Right? That's um so when you like we can go to the you already had the Revenant, but I also found like Hostiles. Have you seen Hostiles as a film? I
Mhm.
thought that one was really well done and sort of I think it was in Kansas when they were in one of the forts, and how it was just that great large number of buildings that they were
One
engaging
of
with.
the interesting surprises are places that were constructed during the Indian campaigns or Indians of the 1870s, but a place like in Nebraska, Fort Robinson.
Mm,
Eventually, it becomes a place where the U.S. military will breed horses and mules for military service.
Oh.
That if you've seen the movie, what's War Horse,
Mm-hmm.
about horses in World War One and World War Two, there's a lot of things you don't think about, that the Army would have a particular fort that was raising horses and mules to participate in the war
Right.
effort. So it's
Right.
kind of different.
No, totally. Yeah. Well, that's a good point. Didn't even think of that. Yeah. Uh, what other any other movies that you can think of that recently came out that were like good in representing the Western fort? Like, I mean, we can have a long list of the bad ones. Of course, it's- that's very easy.
So many of the films are depictions of the Indian Wars.
Right.
It does give this distorted image of they were just fighting all of the time, and a lot of them were taking place around the forts, but that
Right.
wasn't really the case.
Right.
And so it's kind of a misconception to start with,
Right.
because you're you're doing most of the filming around the fort and the interactions there, and so most of the events are happening outside the fort.
Right. It's out there in the plains where the skirmishing takes place rather than pitched battles that make for good movie, but okay.
Or the fighting takes place in the indigenous villages where
Mm-hmm.
soldiers that are stationed at the fort wait until winter, know
Right.
where the indigenous people have settled for the winter, and then go out and do these winter campaigns, especially during the Civil
Right.
War years.
Right. Yeah, no, that was a
Have you
very
seen
brutal.
Dances with Wolves?
Yes, of course.
That was a different kind of a fortification that
Yes,
Lieutenant
that
Dunbar
tiny
goes
little
out to.
one. Yeah, how I was going to
That
ask
didn't look
how
very impressive, did it?
at all. Were there a lot of instances where you have sort of like I know in the Civil War we had sort of like blockhouses where like along the railroads, somewhat river crossings of railroads, they just created like a house type fortifications. Do we have any of that in the West where it's just like I don't know, like 10 men, 20 men are stationed?
I'm not aware of any.
I'm not
There
either,
might
so
be, but that's not something I know.
okay. But I was just curious because it was sort of, like Blockhouse, right? Like Dances with Wolves, like the one man mission.
They used to
Uh,
have those along the railroads. You can
mm,
see those as you drive along the interstate highways and things like that.
yeah,
But that's at a different era,
right,
really. So I
right.
don't think they're really manned now.
Yeah. No. Uh, so final towards growing towards the end here slowly. What's your favorite Plains fort? Like still there, you can go to, you can see. Which one would you like if like I'm tourist wanting to see a real Plains fort or outpost or military post? Like I give you three. Like which three would you say are the best? We start
Well,
with Jeff.
You have some, Jeff?
I, I well, hmm. I haven't been to Fort Benton, but if I was to choose one to go to now, I'd like to go check that out. Have you been there,
Oh,
Jay?
Yes. I've been to Fort Benton, Fort Union, Fort Laramie, Bent's Fort. I would, I think all of those are awesome.
mm,
I grew up outside of a fort. It's not on the plains, but Fort Bridger.
mm-hmm,
It started out as a fur trade fort in the 1840s. Then it became an overland trail emporium, and then it became a military base. So it fits all the models we've been talking about. It's just located 100 miles off the plains.
mm.
Um, but so I grew up going to that place a lot every year, and
Field trip
that's
day.
still a place that I visit. So um,
Yeah.
so I think any of those that have been maintained and are worthwhile to support. 'Cause, 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 'cause,
You're gonna add some of that, or just? I hear a lot of
No,
northern.
I just visited those Fort Lower Gary up in Manitoba, and I thought that was an incredible fort. I would
Yeah.
recommend people go to Winnipeg and take a little road trip up to see
Yeah.
that.
Now I hear a lot of northern plains. What about like Fort Laramie or Fort Union in New Mexico or Fort Davis, Fort Stanton,
Bent's
um,
Fort would be fun.
yeah, Benford.
Mm.
Yeah, Bent's Fort is great. Even the ruins of Fort Union are
Hmm.
interesting. Um, the Alamo, people still go there
Oh yeah, you
in
did have that in
droves.
there.
Yeah, so there's
I kind
there's
of skipped
places in
that
the Southern
section because
Plains
I
too.
didn't like.
Just- I,
Yeah,
I
we didn't
don't get
touch.
to the Southern Plains as often as I do the Northern and Central
Yeah.
Plains.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of Texas forts all through the eras from Spanish colonization up until really today. But we
Yeah.
haven't really touched on them all. But yeah.
Well, you can leave the Alamo out. I don't mind that. Uh,
And there are several of these indigenous places that are
mhm.
National Historic Sites, and people should go and look at those as well
Right,
because it kind of takes them back to imagine what life would have been like
right,
and the difficulties and opportunities of using those kinds of establishments and
right.
fortifications.
Now, it makes this a final one. Do you think that in part we still have sort of that Hollywoodized popular image of the Western fort? Because, like, I mean, let's face it, like, when you talk about some of these forts in Montana or West Texas or New Mexico or West Kansas or Western Nebraska, we're not talking tourist trails. We're not talking like easily accessible for like you're a tourist from Europe, you're going to California, you're going to Florida, you're going to the Grand Canyon, Las Vegas, maybe Phoenix. You're not going to Montana. You're not going to West Kansas. Is that maybe a contributing factor why the image still is sort of that somewhat unrealistic for it?
Yeah, that's hard to answer because I think if they were to go to the forts that have been reconstructed, it might reinforce the misconception
True.
rather than
Hmm.
take it on. And so, yeah, that's a great question. It's I don't know.
Most of the forts that have been reconstructed um, were some of the more important ones of their era, and so I think that they're worthwhile to visit, just as interesting as some of the other places people travel to
Oh yeah.
in the United States. So
Yeah.
um, put it on your bucket list. Come back over and check some of these out.
No, I mean I enjoyed. I saw Fort Union and Fort Davis, Fort Craig, not quite a Plains fort, but I found it was wonderful experiences to kind of see this just the expanse, right? You can't visualize with a map or images how big these forts actually were with all of these buildings, the quarters for the soldiers, officers, commissary, hospital, like this whole machinery that goes with it.
Well, they were many communities.
Yeah,
All of the families that were participating, as well as the men and others that were employed there. But some of the forts, like Fort Garry up in Manitoba, um, it's in downtown Winnipeg. The city's
right.
built around it. It's the
Yeah.
exact center of town, and so um, that's why they reconstructed Lower Fort Garry because it's
Easier.
outside of town, and they didn't have to fight with the hotels and the all the infrastructure of
Right,
the
right.
city. So
No,
um,
totally.
that's interesting point though that some of these forts became towns and cities and
Hmm.
communities, and so they were kind of subsumed by the urban sprawl. But
Right.
those that were in remote areas that are not always on the tourist path, those are the ones that end up getting reconstructed. So that's fascinating.
Crazy, right? All right. Well, I greatly appreciate you guys taking the time today to talk about your new book and the fascinating topics that plains forts are, from ancient Native American times to the modern day and in the US and Canada. If you're interested in the book, it's Great Plains Forts by J. Buckley and Jeffrey Nokes, published by Bison Press, and you can get it obviously at the Bison Press,
Yeah,
Bison
University of
Books
Nebraska
Press, and
Press or
University of
Bison Book
Nebraska Press. Yes, thank you.
or Amazon
Or
whatever.
Amazon, or independent booksellers, or potentially a signed copy by email from either Jeff or Jay, if you're interested.
There
But
you
again,
go.
thank you so much for taking the time and chatting about your wonderful project.
Thanks,
Yeah, you're
Niels.
very welcome. Yeah, thank you.